Hello. My name is Gabriella Pagefort, and I'm an editor with Amazon Crossing. And I'm here with a lovely panel of translators to talk about the subject, translating the living. As an editor, it's very interesting to me to think about the way authors and translators relate to one another, and the way that that relationship develops seems to be different from project to project, and from author to author, depending on the translator's preferences and the author's grasp of the language. And I thought it might be interesting to gather a panel of translators from various languages with various backgrounds, and to try to think about their different perspectives on working with authors directly on translations. At my right here, I have Andrew Cothery, who translates from Icelandic to English, and his wife, to his right, is Björg Arnadóttir, and they are quite a cool duo. They translate together. Andrew is British, Björg was born in Iceland, and the two of them really become quite a dynamic pair in terms of covering the nuances of the Icelandic and the nuances of the English, and coming together with translations. Together, they've recently completed their third book for the Amazon Crossing list, called Sun on Fire, by Victor Arner Ingelsson. To their right is Roland Glasser, who has translated over 20 books from French, including art, travel, and assorted nonfiction, as well as fiction. And he has extensive experience as a commercial translator and a liaison interpreter as well. He's a committee member of the Translators Association, and many of you know him as the forum administrator for the Emerging Translators Network. He has recently completed a translation of Anne Cuneo's fascinating historical novel, Le Trajet d'une Rivière. And this is a collaboration with a translator named Louise Rogers Lalaurie. Lalaurie, thank you. And Other Stories will be publishing that book in 2015. And the project was awarded a Max Geilinger translation grant. And I haven't had the pleasure of working directly with Roland on a translation yet, but I hope to in the future. And then finally we have Tom Bunstead, or shall I call you Thomas? He's a writer as well as a translator. And he's worked on many different types of projects, including short stories, reviews, interviews, and essays featured in publications such as the Times Literary Supplement, Independent on Sunday, Paris Review blog, Words Without Borders. And he has translated a novel by Antonio Garrido for Amazon Crossing. So I think we'll get started just trying to understand a little bit more about the relationship between author and translator. Maybe we can start with you, Tom, to tell us about a time that you worked directly with an author on a translation, and maybe give us an idea of the types of questions you asked and the way the relationship evolved.
So is this on? Are we on? Yeah. Well, there's a number of examples. I mean, I've done the Amazon Crossings book. I've done a number of others as well, and it's always tried to sort of pick out a particular moment, but it's always very collaborative. There tends to be something in the process whereby you'll gather together some questions for the end once you've done your draft, sometimes 20 or 30 questions, which you'll send to the author for them to clarify on, which is one of the most sort of basic ways in which you have your relationship with them. As we'll sort of get into as the panel progresses, there's so many nuances. Apart from anything, it depends on the level of English of your author. Sometimes you'll have the publisher will sort of be an intermediary almost between you and the author, or you'll indeed be sort of presenting the author's answers to the publisher. So it really, often the pace is sort of set by the expectations of the publisher, and what they sort of want from the book varies a lot.
Roland, you have quite different experiences. I wonder if maybe you could tell us about some relationships you've developed.
Yeah, I mean, there's can be sort of different kind of things that you might talk to an author about. So, in the book that I've been working on recently for And Other Stories, which is a historical novel, there were most of the questions that we had for the author regarded particular points of historical detail, and she'd done a huge amount of research, and so even though it was set, a large part of it is set in England and concerns English history, which I'm not unfamiliar with, there were little points that we needed to check. on other projects, the questions might be more to do with linguistic questions, precise meanings of particular expressions. And then you have the various points where you think you found something where the author's made a mistake, or someone's hair color has changed between two chapters, or things like that, or they've got a date wrong, and you have to kind of find a diplomatic way to bring that up with them.
Would you like to give an example of a meaning question? I think that's of the family of issues that you might raise with an author, a potential misunderstanding or a potential curiosity around meaning is a hard space to raise questions in. Do you have maybe an example?
My mind's gone blank for a moment. You'll have to get back to me on that one.
It's the spotlight.
I mean, I'd say, although it's the sort of grist of this conversation, in fact, it's not that hard a thing, and it's very common to have to raise these things with the author. I mean, so ranging from ambiguities in the text, which you must check, to certainly. So I work from the Spanish, and I don't think it's any sort of secret that Spanish fiction is often edited far more lightly than here in the UK, certainly, and the same with the US publishers I worked with. They have slightly different standards. So you might come up with, I've come across plot holes, inconsistencies, ranging from the minor to the pretty major. And in terms of, I suppose, if there's young translators here, if that's part of the focus, sort of how one might raise that kind of thing. I mean, at the end of your draft, you're going to have to raise some things anyway. So something that I have done is you sort of go to them and say, I noticed this thing. Have I understood it correctly? Because if I have, I think it means this for the rest of the text. Or the other thing is that you can use the publisher as a kind of buffer and just throw it to them to throw at the author. That's another way around.
We're not always happy buffers.
Yeah.
But I think that the question is the same in terms of how do you open the mind of the author to your innocence and naivete in your reading and allow them to sort of bring you better understanding of the text itself. So I personally, as an editor, find that space really, really meaningful. And I know in our work with Victor Arner, he's been a very gentle and pleasant author. Gentile. To work with, and I think that it's been very interesting for me as an editor approaching things like the suggestion to, for example, convert from the metric system for our primarily American audience. And Victor Arner is an engineer, and there are engineers at the core of his plot, and the idea of changing from kilometers for a novel set in Iceland written by an engineer kind of blew his mind, and he wasn't really on board. And Bjorg and Andrew really helped me to manage that conversation, and I wonder if you can maybe talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that concerned me was that this was a novel set in Iceland and in Europe, and however difficult it is for the American reader to cope with metric measurements, I felt it was important to make them not shy away from the fact that the book was set not in America. If you want it all converted into nice, easy units of measurement, then you're going to end up making it sound as if it's set in Baltimore, which is not what we wanted. On the general thing about working with Victor Adnar, I agree, he was very easy to work with. What we did, rather than saving everything up for the end, was we'd send him, in the course of doing his books, we'd send him about 7 or 8 times during the course of working on it, the chunk of what we'd just done, several chapters, for him to read over, and then that would come back for him with a few little things, some of which we agreed with, some of which we didn't, but we always seemed to be able to settle things amicably. And by the end of it, by the time we were on the second book, we would raise things with him, and he tended to say, "I'm sure that your solution will be absolutely fine. Go ahead," which was really great, having that kind of freedom and trust from him.
Are there any examples where the author's preference didn't win and the that trust was compromised in anyone's experience?
Well, on units of measurement, the only thing was that you wouldn't let us have people's heights in meters and centimeters. We had to have heights as feet and inches, but that was okay.
We made a compromise.
And on the thing about accuracy, Victor Udner is by profession an engineer, so he's a huge stickler for getting things right. And one of the points about that first book was that the character was also an engineer who worked in several different countries, including working in Britain and working in America. And as a character, he was always saying that was so many meters, which is the same as, or the other way around, he'd say, the measurement of this particular locomotive was so many feet and inches, that is so many meters and centimeters. So it was important that we preserve this character's punctiliousness about these units.
On the subject of research, I'm really interested in understanding when a translator feels inclined to double check or to do their own research, and when the text, the original, is sort of taken as fact. How do you think through those challenges, and when do you decide to take to the internet or to take to the library and find your own sources?
I check nearly everything, and that's probably partly because I'm, unhealthily curious about absolutely everything. So, yeah. So if a particular event, person, occurrence, fish, bird, leaf, whatever is mentioned, I want to know: is it really called that? Did it really happen then? What more can I find out about it? Even if it isn't strictly necessary to what I'm doing. But that's also partly, it's a way into finding out. It can often lead you to find out other things that become necessary. So, I don't know, there might be a passing reference to, a battle, and you check the date, and you find that there's some detail in the way the battle happened that actually chimes with something that's mentioned in the story or the character, for example. In literature, that's kind of a hangover that comes from, I guess, a lot of my commercial work or work on non-fiction, where there are a lot of things you need to check and people often get wrong. So that's probably become a kind of reflex for me.
Tom, with your work with Antonio Garrido, his historical language was a real challenge, I think, with both of the books we published by him. And thinking about research in particular, were there any tools you used to check the English you were using against the historical time period of the novel?
I sometimes, for a translation, will use a book that's extant in our tradition to sort of hook the voice on, particularly if it's a first-person narration, and particularly kind of, I found, if you're having to work at pace, and you run out of oomph, you run out of I don't know, maybe your original sort of strong and sharp sense of how it should be feeling in the English. I have, with a number of books, had sort of 2 or 3 books in mind that I'll just turn to, just at random, sort of read a little bit and sort of refresh my own sense of the kind of English that I'm aiming for. It's not really a research question, but I kind of really like the idea of that as a practice as well, in terms of being the translator as writer, someone who's working within the English tradition and sort of speaking to that as well.
As an editor, I actually use that trick in choosing books too, to try to understand if something will translate well, to sort of test my ear, reading books that are popular in a similar subject and trying to understand whether this is something that sort of relates in some way to the English language norm or trend, particularly for genre fiction. So it's interesting to think that translators are doing that in a similar way. I wonder if there might be something to be gained by sharing our reading notes.
There is a really fantastic resource for checking historical usage, and that's the Oxford English Dictionary Online, which you can access if you have any library reading card. And it has a historical thesaurus, which functions like a regular thesaurus. You put in a word and it gives you all the different possibilities for that from throughout history. And then a kind of the normal dictionary section, which gives more details with quotes from when particular words were first recorded. And it's useful in two ways. It is partly useful if your book is set in a particular period and you want to make sure that you're using language which would have been used then. But also you find that there are so many words we use every day in English that are really, really old. And so many words which you think must be quite old and they're quite recent. But it kind of leads you to use words which are used today, but you don't maybe use that often anymore. And it's particularly, I would say, because there's a problem sometimes when you translate from a Romance language, because there are so many words in British that, we have Anglo-Saxon words and words that come from Romance languages. It's often good when translating to try and find the Anglo-Saxon word rather than the word that came from French. And so that's kind of a good tool to find all those interesting words which you maybe don't use as much as you should or could.
Going to have to help our American translators find something as magical as the British Library card. Yeah. We have to pay quite a bit for our subscriptions. That's great. One of the interesting things about our panelists is that we have an actor and a musician on the panel. And I think that the idea of translation as an interpretive act and a creative interpretation of the original work was something that in preparing this panel sort of came to light as one of the interesting commonalities among our panelists. And I wonder if maybe we can talk about those experiences a little bit.
Yes, I think when you asked me to be on this panel, my immediate thought was I haven't got anything to say. And then that triggered a memory back from way back when we attended a screening of an Icelandic film here in London. And it was attended by the director and the producer and one of the leading actors. And a question and answer session followed. They went up on stage, questions were fired, and the director and the producer, they both answered, and the actor was standing there. He was looking at the floor, or he would gaze into space and not saying a word. And then after a while somebody said, "What has the actor got to say about this?" At which point he said, "Nothing." Cordelia-like, "I've got nothing to say. I'm an actor. My job is to interpret scripts." And you can see why I thought this. But then I started connecting the dots, and I thought, but hang on, that's exactly what we translators do. We get the script. It's our job is to interpret it, is to hear the writer's voice and try and get it across. And then we talked about this, and of course Andrew used to be a musician, and it's the same for musicians.
Yes, if you're a musician, you've got to look at the dots on the page and get your fingers around them, and you've got to actually have the technique to play the dots. But once you've mastered them, you've then got to put yourself in the mind of the composer and play them and put meaning and feeling into them. And if you don't do that, however well you play the dots, it's just dead. And it's the same in translation. You've got to get hold of the meaning and then give it the author's life.
And everybody's interpretation will be different.
Yeah.
And that's also a really important thing to remember. There's not one proper performance. There's not one proper translation. And bearing that in mind also kind of takes some of the pressure off, just to realise that you do your best to provide the best interpretation, but in a sense you have to trust that process will produce something which is as best as you can can make it, but there'll be no one thing that you could ever hope to capture perfectly. But yeah.
You do your best.
Bjorg, you mentioned that the books you were reading as a child, they switched
Oh,
translators on you.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes. I was an avid reader, and best time of year was Christmas, because everybody gives books for Christmas presents in Iceland. And my best Christmas ever was when I had 11 books from various people. And I think this was the Enid Blyton books that I was very into at the time. And I absolutely loved them, couldn't wait for the next Christmas, because they only came out one a year. And one year, I just didn't like it so much, and I didn't know why. It was just different. And finally, I was looking at the title page and realized it wasn't the same person who had translated it. There was a different name there that explained it. It was so important. That voice was gone. Another one had come in, probably just as good, but
It was different.
it was different. So,
Both of the translators working, or both of the translations for Amazon Crossing happened to be new translators from an author we had already published with a different translator. And as an editor, I'm always very cautious about reading each translator's work with that assumption that there's a uniqueness and that there's going to be difference, but also with the idea of the reader's expectations and sort of looking out for disappointments. And one of the things that I've tried to do to sort of bridge that difference, which is usually caused by scheduling more than anything else, is to hire the same editors and to pay them to read the first translation and ask them to sort of take some things into consideration, especially if there's any characters in common. Neither of these were series that had a lot of connectivity from book to book, but I think it's actually kind of an interesting coincidence. And I wonder if, Tom, for example, if you had any instances with Antonio Garrido where you looked at the decisions of the other translator who had worked with him and gave that any thought.
Well, so in fact, mine was the first
was the other way
Antonio
around.
Grillo, and there's been another one subsequently. But I have done I did a co-translation last year of an Enrique Villamatas book, which is coming out with new directions later this year, and that was with Anne McLean, who's Villamatas's usual translator. She's done some co-translations with other people, but part of my task, I sort of did a first draft of a couple of chapters, and our co-translation. There's a panel tomorrow morning all about co-translation, so I won't go on too much about it. But she sort of sent me back. I was quite familiar with Villamatas's work, already done a couple of his short stories, but I hadn't read I'd read a lot of him in Spanish, but I've only read one of her translations of his work. And she said, go away and have a look at what I've done, the 4 or 5 books that I've done so far. And I kind of went off and immersed myself in them and came back and sort of did a different job of it. So I think it, particularly, if an author's got a following, then in the target language, then that's potentially quite important, yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right.
We also had a little funny anecdote that I wonder if you were interested in sharing. Are you interested in sharing your? Bjorg has done quite a bit of work, both from English into Icelandic and from Icelandic into English, and I think that's kind of an interesting position to be in, because oftentimes editors such as myself are only looking to work with native speakers of the target language. And I think that there's a lot of nuances that come from the work in translation beyond just literature, books. And Bjork has had some experiences doing subtitling for popular programming. And I think that the idea of the language nuances and also the sort of byways and explorations of usage that you've experienced with your work in subtitling might be of interest. No?
I don't know. I know what story you're referring to. It's at the time I was. I'll make it short. I was translating Family Guy, and there was a reference to a certain something of unsavory nature, which looked quite innocent to me, but I didn't know what it meant. So I asked my son. He was in his 20s, and he said, I can't believe my mother is asking me that. But normally what we do when we work as a team, and when we translate into English, I do the initial translation from Icelandic into English, and then Andrew comes along and is my editor. So if there's any question of meaning, I can ask him. I think you were working that day. It was before you retired from being a musician.
Well, and even as an American, you don't necessarily catch every nuance in a comedy program like that. And thinking about how you might train yourself not only to translate them once you've noticed you've caught a joke, but also to sort of be attuned to catch them all. I thought Roland's comment about research and the idea that the context of what you're looking up might actually be echoed in a very subtle way, and without having done that research, you wouldn't have known that.
But sorry, can I just butt in?
Please.
Talking about hearing voices, I mean, this is I'm just talking subtitling, and I also translated 24, and there's Jack Bauer and people busy shooting each other, and it's all very fast, and you can only have so many letters. And of course, you use slang because that's how these people speak. And I remember once somebody complained because this wasn't classical Icelandic. And I mean, they're not going to speak literary language as they're busy shooting each other and killing each other. I thought that was...
I wonder if anyone has examples of that, where you actually have to completely change the original in order to capture its intent.
Well, you're always doing that as a translator, right?
Yeah.
You're not creating replicas, you're making something new. I mean...
with idioms, it happens all the time.
Yeah, idioms it's particularly strongest, yeah. Got an example?
Well, kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah,
Pot's calling the kettle black. They all have, often they'll have equivalents in the other languages, but sometimes they'll be the same, and it'll just be the same. Other times you have to find something else. What does get complicated sometimes, and I can't think of a specific example, but the author will maybe use an idiom which is particularly interesting or amusing because it refers to the situations or the characters. If you were having a passage about birds and a stone and you said kill two birds with one stone, it would work. And you have the problem where you can't translate that directly into English because maybe we don't have the equivalent. So do you change something about the character or the situation or the story or something like that?
And do you run those types of things by the author, or are most of those independent decisions?
I think it depends. I guess it would depend if it was a very major thing or not. I think probably generally not, unless it was something that was quite important and maybe affected other things in the book or...
Yeah, it's to do with sort of like the texture of the text, I suppose. There's some stuff that's low level and is just part of the sort of fabric of it, but I don't know if someone's been given a nickname in the source language and it's not going to work to create a replica. So you're going to need to sort of shift. You need to go a little bit lateral and kind of do something that gets across the spirit of the thing. I think in the latter case, you'd explain to the author, this doesn't quite work in English, so I want to sort of do this, and you explain how it kind of works in English and and then they might go, no, this is really important, like that nickname has this sort of resonance, and you just have a bit of a conversation about it.
Yes, we had a point in the, I can't remember whether it was the second or third book that we've done of Victor Arnar's, and there was a character who was being introduced, and they said, this is so-and-so, and this is his husband, so-and-so. And the name in the original of the second person, slightly unusual Icelandic name, but an Icelander would know that this is a man's name. But it wasn't sufficiently obviously a man's name, and I didn't want the reader to think, oh, that's a misprint. It means his wife. So I emailed the author and said, can we change his name? And I suggested David, because I thought, everybody knows David is a man's name. And he said, yeah, that's fine, that's a good idea. So we did. So that the shock, if there is a shock to the reader, was not a typographical one, but the fact that they were husband and husband.
I think titles often fall into that case where it doesn't quite work the same way in English as it might have in the original. I wonder if anyone has any interesting examples of proposing alternative titles.
I've got one for a book that I think is being agented around. It hasn't actually been published, but in the Spanish it was Los Garros del Niño Inútil, which is very literally that's the hooks of the useless child. And so I had a bit of a conversation, not actually with the author in this case, but with the agency who are based in Germany. I just sort of said, are you thinking of doing this literally? Because comes across a bit strangely in English. I mean, this German agent, she understood it very well. And we came up with, so garros can be sort of nails, claws, but it can also mean a grappling hook. And so that was one of the things that I suggested, just the grappling hook, and that they went with. So you want to find something that... I had another thing recently. It's just different sort of conventions, I suppose, but a book that was in the Spanish... La Abuela Civil Española. So a sort of play on La Guerra Civil Española, but the agency's original idea for how to translate that. So that is literally the Spanish civil grandmother, and that was what they were going to go with until I sort of went, I'm not sure that's going to work. So, but you want to find something, and then again, it's a thing of sort of thinking about kind of what there is in the sort of ecosystem of English titles that you might create a resonance with. It's whole different conventions.
And in English we quite like titles that are maybe that there's someone's quite whimsical or slightly ironic, or we have a tradition of that which you don't always get in other cultures. And so when you're thinking of a title, you're also thinking about how you'll market as well. You might even be thinking about the cover. There might be various things that come into play, as well as the meaning of it.
Are there any other ideas that anyone wants to throw out before we move on to questions?
I don't know. I was just going to say that I don't know. I think it's great to be able to work with an author. I think it's a great privilege because you have access to the person who wrote it. You have access to the person who, in many ways, knows the world of the book the best. It can also sometimes be at the same time, those things that make it good can sometimes make it problematic because they're too close to it. And particularly if they know English, it can be sometimes a little difficult when they think that maybe they know better than you how certain things should be translated, or but yeah, I think if you approach things diplomatically. So, for example, if there's something, I ask far too many questions, I think, and I even ask questions about things which probably are obvious, but I think that I've seen an ambiguity, even though probably it's quite clear. But, I'll always take the approach of, I'm not sure if I've understood this quite correctly, but I was wondering if you meant that, or did you mean this or that? And so just give them some room to sort of feel that maybe it's me that's made the mistake, or,
There's just a little story about these books of Victor Ratner, which are detective books. And there was a point, the author himself is an engineer, as I said, and I'm convinced that he draws plans of things, and I know that he visits the various places where things happen in his books to make sure that he's got the layout of the countryside right and all that kind of thing. And there are a couple of things where, in one of the books, there was a point near the end where there's a particular object which is hidden in a particular place in the house. And we didn't quite understand from what he'd written from the Icelandic precisely how this object was held in place. So we emailed him, and quick as a flash he came back with a beautiful drawing of the place with little arrows pointing and labels saying what the various bits were, so that we could just translate the picture, and that was fine. And there was another occasion at the beginning of the second book where somebody crouches behind what was described as an old ruin in order to shoot at somebody. And when we sent Victor Radnar our draft of the first few chapters, he came back and he said, no, the word you've used, it makes it sound like a big building, it's not that. So we sort of challenged it and said, well, okay, well, what is it? And he simply sent us a photograph of it. And there it was, this little thing. So we could see exactly what it was and find the right words for it.
I think the main thing is to ask these questions. I think that's the intelligent thing to do. Not to pretend that you know or try and work it through, but just to ask the questions. I think it's fine.
That's a natural segue to perhaps some questions. I wonder if anyone has any questions for our panelists. The lovely image, microphone here.
Mine was more by way of a comment, really, because I thought I'd like to add something to the discussion. I translate from Chinese, and I've translated about a dozen authors, so I've experienced, I've had a range of experiences, from asking questions about what particular kind of shack something was, of the kind that you said, to one where the author spoke very good English, and I knew she was going to check the chapters, and this was all rather scary. And I read the book before I started. I read it, and I could see that her style was extremely rich and vivid, and she had huge numbers of similes, so every other sentence was a simile, which in Chinese you can express without repeating yourself, but in English you've really only got as if or like. So I took my courage in both hands and emailed her and said, I just can't do all these similes, but I promise you that I will find any number of metaphors or whatever, and you will see that I'll do my best to get everything into English. It just ain't going to be that many similes. And yeah, it was good. It was a very, very fruitful collaboration, and really the best that I've had, but it could have gone either way, so it was rather scary. Yes. But it was fine in the end.
Hello, I'm Nicolette Hoekmeijer. I'm a translator from the Netherlands, and last year I've been to Canada, to the Banff Literary Translation Center, where I stayed for 3 weeks, and 1 week with the author I was translating at that time. And I thought it would be sort of not really worthwhile, because my problems were especially how to phrase things in Dutch, but it was a very rewarding experience to work with him for a week. And I was wondering, is there sort of a residency in England too, where these things happen? Like translators working with their authors?
There's one set up at the summer school at the British. You're asking about the UK or just in the English, in the sort of Anglophone world? Certainly in the UK, the British Centre for Literary Translation runs a summer school, and it's a week-long workshop where there's between sort of 5 and 10 translators, usually sort of emerging translators, an experienced translator, and then the author, and you spend a week going through a text, really sort of fine, very, very slow work. Everyone sort of produces their own work, and you just have a conversation, and often, half a day you'll spend over a sentence, that kind of thing.
Then everybody's translating the same text?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of presentation at the end of the week where you all come to, well, I mean, about to say sort of some people have to grit their teeth for, but you come to an agreement for the text. Actually, it's a really good grounding and kind of, eventually having to work. It's not just going to be the translator's work in the end. There's as we've been talking about, the collaboration with the author, but also different publishers are going to want different things from the book. They've got different readerships in mind, and it's quite a good grounding just in kind of, I think sort of sharing the ownership. Like, I think it's sort of wrong to go into this kind of thing thinking this is mine, and like I've got it right. So there's that. That was kind of the first thing I did in literary translation, and it's highly recommended.
Yeah, me too. It was the first thing I did. It was great, and it's great when you're working with your fellow translators and you're seeing all the different ways you can translate stuff. And a similar thing happens with the translation slams, translation duels that sort of happen several times a year at various literary events here, where you have two translators that have worked on the same text and will present them before an audience. And you often end up thinking, if you could get the best of one and the best of the other one and sort of mix them together, and you'd sort of have the perfect cocktail. But I think that, there are various sort of literary translation residencies and retreats in Europe. And I think probably most of them would be quite amenable if, you wanted your author to come and join you for a few days, or, things like that. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering whether any of you have had experiences of authors who have been unwilling or reluctant to engage with you in kind of discussing your queries or your concerns, if there have been loopholes or things that haven't quite worked out once you've translated it and thought, hang on a second, the hair colour's changed, or that date doesn't work or something, and how you've dealt with that, or how that's influenced your approach to the translation that you've eventually agreed on with the publisher?
Not me. I've never experienced that, so I don't know.
I've heard of people who have been in that situation, and it sounds horrendous. But luckily, I haven't.
I mean, I haven't worked with any sort of truculent authors or anyone who's, taciturn in any way. I mean, something that I definitely find, I'm sure the same, Izzy, like really helpful. It's just probably an author's, you have to assume that they're busy writing other stuff. And I mean, I've only really got one out of the authors that I've translated that I've done enough of his stuff that I could just ping him an email and go, I'm not sure about this. With the other ones, I think it's better to sort of build up a list of things for the end, so that they can, apart from anything, they might have written this particular book that you're working on any number of years ago. So they need to sort of go back to the text, get that sort of mindset back on, and think about it again. So that helps. I mean, I've translated a book by Eduardo Alfon, which was a co-translation, but he was fully bilingual. He's a Guatemalan author, and he moved to Miami in his early teens, so totally had English. And one of the things, it wasn't just that he had. Oh, okay. So actually, when he's writing, he's sufficiently bilingual that he says that he thinks his sentences in English and then brings them back down on the page in Spanish. So he has a real sense, and actually you can. There's certain Anglo-oriented things about his sentence constructions that you can see in the actual text, but he has a real sense of how he wants it to be in English. So it wasn't so much like an unpleasant situation where we, because that was a co-translation, wanted one thing and he wanted another, but the conversation was longer. He had more to say about the actual final text.
Hi, I translate from Arabic, and who asked the question about somebody being reluctant to engage. I actually have examples of all sorts of things like that, but the one that I was thinking of very recently, which was interesting, is a male author who used a word, just one word, to describe some young women who were just glimpsed very much in passing from a taxi window, and this word really opened up a can of worms, because it's he would only go so far in actually discussing with me really the implications of the word. And I think probably because he was probably embarrassed to be questioned this much by a female British translator. And it's a word that to some native speakers' ear means kind of implies that the person's a sex worker or behaving like a sex worker on such one end of the spectrum, and would be perhaps best translated as sluttish or something. But I didn't want to put that word into the narrator's mouth, because I thought that sort of misogynistic, phallocratic language was inappropriate and would be overly shocking to the audience and so on. And anyway, to some native speakers it sounds more like playful or flirtatious. But yeah, it was interesting because he wouldn't get very far with me. He wouldn't go very far with me in actually, admitting quite how he'd used the word. And I think it probably brought him up short, actually, to realise that that's the kind of description he'd employed. But I also have experienced when, the other thing about when a writer really thinks their English is better than it is, and I think that can be very, very, very challenging.
That would be a nightmare, yeah.
That can be very challenging. And also the thing that you just referred to about someone who's slightly thinking in English but writing in another language happens quite a lot with Arabic, with some people that have been internationally educated and they're slightly caught between two languages, and that can be very interesting but very challenging, I think.
What word did you choose?
I actually I still have the chance to possibly fiddle with it. I'm still thinking I might go with coquettish. It's archaic, but it's not as judgmental and somehow has something of the spirit. People can suggest if they want to see me often. But definitely not sluttish. I'm not putting that in anyone's mouth.
Hi, I'm not a translator, but I'm an author, and this is a different area of the world, but I published the 3 books in Korean, and I'm trying to find a good translator for my book. And do you have any advices, how I should go by of finding the right translator for my book? And at the same time, how do you negotiate the price of the translation and things of that nature?
Well, I would say the first thing is that probably you're going to be wanting to try and find a publisher maybe before you find the translator, although I suppose you'd want to have a translator who would be able to submit a sample in English to the publisher. Yeah.
Well, you're in the right place, being in the Literary Translation Centre. The TA, the Translators Association in the UK, you can go to them and simply ask them who are the Korean to English translators and what have they done, and maybe find someone who's the work that they've already translated you feel has an affinity with your work or something like that. But no doubt Samir's a pricked up. I don't know. Are there any Korean translators around?
I do know of one. I can give you her name afterwards.
Anna, right?
No, Deborah Smith. She's the only Korean translator in the UK, I think.
Oh yeah. On Thursday, there's going to be who's got the program? There's a Korean translation slam. I think sort of later, maybe in this slot in the afternoon.
But yeah, so just to add though, the Translators Association website also has a directory where you can look up translators by name, or I think by language as well.
And presumably they can advise about rates.
Yes, but yeah, it's complicated because generally you would never get a full book translated before you had a publisher, and then the question of rates becomes really an issue for the publisher and the translator rather than between you and the translator.
Well, if that's all the questions... Oh, we have one more.
Yeah, just a quick one about translating idioms. Have any of you ever completely missed one and taken it as literal?
Yes.
Thank you, then I'm not alone.
I think it was probably corrected, but at some point. But yeah, I'm sure I've done that. Yeah, yeah.
We always hope to catch it in the editing, and one of the ways that I read for errors is simply by trying to pay attention to something that sounds funny or a sort of dead end in the language. And almost always, I think that's the way to do it. And so when you work with people who are really well steeped in the idioms of the English language, it tends to sort of jump out at you. And I've had a lot of translators thank us for the help in catching those mistakes before it's too late. Authors tend to be pretty wonderful about having a look for that too. And I often will specifically ask the authors to read it, especially if they have a good English, to read a chapter carefully and to let me know if anything rings strangely, because we might need to teach the author about an American idiom or a British idiom, or we might have a mistake we can fix.
I actually have an example of that, actually. There's an expression in French which literally would translate as to run up the steps 4 at a time, to take the steps 4 at a time. But it actually more means just to run up the stairs very quickly than literally to take the steps 4 at a time. And there was, actually with the book I'm just completing now, which is a co-translation, and my co-translator has sort of got that as he runs up the stairs 4 at the time, but it was the stairs to the entrance of the house outside, and so I don't think there would have been 4 steps. And so, but yeah, there are things like that where it could be literal, but probably it isn't in that context.
I just got involved at the very early stage to translate some theoretical social scientific papers and books of leading scholars from the West into Chinese language. I just wonder, in terms of the legal and financial side, would there be any difference regarding the still living original author and the one who has passed away for like over 50 years in the West?
In terms of what? In terms of quoting them?
Copyright and the fees.
So you're going into Chinese?
Yes.
You mean in terms of publishing them?
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I assume that if it's beyond a certain period of time, which I think is 50 years, it could be, or it could be 75, 70 years.
Different countries have different rules.
Different countries have different rules, but I'm not sure we'd be the experts to answer that.
Any direction to find this kind of legal stuff?
There's a Wikipedia page that lists copyright laws by country.
Yeah.
And I would dig a level deeper than that, but that's my starting point to raise questions. And then it usually helps me find sources to find very specific answers to the question for each country.
That's a yellow page.
If you go to Wikipedia, and look up copyright law, you can actually find a sort of listing by country of what the rules are.
And I know that the British Library, I believe, has an intellectual property centre. That might be a point of contact for trying to find out stuff like that.
And if the author has any kind of web presence, even sometimes heirs will continue to renew copyright. So sometimes you can actually get in contact with the person who can absolutely tell you. It's always worth the research.
And I think there's even some kind of society for copyright, blah-de-blah, whatever. If you search online for copyright law, you'll eventually come to it.
Be in the back. I think this is our last question.
Just a word of encouragement to translators, actually, to end, which is quite nice, I think. When you are communicating with authors, and I do have that opportunity quite a lot, remember that there's FaceTime and there's Skype. We don't have to do all our communication via email and be a text-based little mouse at the computer, communicating with another person text-based, because there's so much in communication that gets lost in the text, in the email. And if you have a query and you can develop a relationship with your author and open their eyes to the dilemmas that translators face, then you're in a much better position to produce a happy result for both parties. That's all.
That's very lovely.
And I think that if you have an opportunity, maybe sometimes to meet the author, maybe even before you start work, it can be good just to suss out each other's character, and depending on the situation.
I'd like to thank you all for your great questions, and thanks to our translators. We've brought some complimentary books translated by our panelists, and they're over in the Amazon Crossing corner, so I encourage you to grab a couple of books before you go, and thanks very much. Happy translating.